order and take roll call if everyone's ready.
Councilmember Newsma. Here. Councilmember Wynn. Councilmember Burns. Councilmember Reed. Councilmember Kelly. Here. Committee Member McMillan.
Here.
Committee Member Rikus.
Are we not hearing her? Did you see that she was online? I mean,
Me? Oh, okay. Sorry. Sorry, rookie up here.
okay, let's restart. Call to order. Let's restart on the.
All right, we'll call the roll.
Roll.
Councilmember Newsma. Here. Councilmember Wynn. Here. Councilmember Reed. Councilmember Burns. Councilmember Kelly. Here. Committee Member McMillan. Here. Committee Member Rikus.
Here.
And Chair Livingston.
Here. Okay, very good. So we have a quorum. Okay, so he is on phone. Very good. All right, so let's go to public comment. Anyone registered or? Okay, all right, so whoever wants to go first. Thank you. And so how many people do we think we have? How many people are on online for public comment?
I see. Looks like perhaps 3 non-council members or staff.
Okay.
So 2 of those are the media, so it looks like we just have 1 person online.
Okay. All right, very good.
All right.
We do have, it's an informal 3-minute thing, but that's soft, so
I
just
appreciate
keep
that.
going.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, I want to say I'm so glad you guys exist because this is a really wonderful way to have an open forum and discuss the finances that we taxpayers go crazy at in our living rooms with our significant others because we work so hard to live in this town. So I just want to say thank you. I am here again to speak on the surplus. I am concerned that we have found another 10 million. I'm glad we found it. I'm concerned that we found it because we shouldn't be that far over budgeted or in surpluses. And I'm on the Parks and Recreation Board, and our parks are in horrendous shape. And we scrounge for every penny. And there's money here, and we have a capital improvements budget, and I think we need to have a really good public discussion with how this capital improvements budget is going to happen. We also, for the last 3 years, have had huge surpluses, and we haven't been maintaining our buildings. Or if we have, we don't know it because when records have been FOIA'd, they don't seem to exist. So I don't understand how 2 of our major things that a community government is responsible for, which is their buildings, assets, and their parks and rec, are failing, and we have a $30 million budget. There's a lot of cities that surplus. There's a lot of cities, as you well know, that don't even have that much in their budget. And so I hope we will really look at this. We got to figure out how come we're screwing this up so royally and get our pensions paid down, reduce the tax burden, not spend things on projects. We have enough projects out there. We don't need new unexpected projects coming in from the left or the right that we haven't thought about. You know, we need to plan 3, 5, 10 years like other places do. Yesterday I was reading about Glencoe and their new golf course renovation, and they're sending it to the referendum, and they have a whole beautiful flyer on how this is going to happen and what it's going to cost and what it's going to cost people. And they're inviting people to, all the participants, Glencoe got a mailer on it. And I know that's expensive, but Glencoe, just so you know, their parks cost about improvements over the last ones that I've been tracking for the last 4 years have been about 60 to 80% at most of how much ours are. And I think we need to look at our budget. I think we need to look at our contracts. And I think we have to make it easier for people to come to our city and be able to work in our city and be able to get the construction contracts that will not be always top dollar because we're known to be a difficult city to work with. So I thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it. And let's get this budget under control.
Thank you. Next, in person.
Good afternoon. I'm Ray Friedman, Second Ward, and I'd like to say ditto to everything that Mary said. I agree with her 100%. I have a whole lot of questions about, and I'm really glad that Finance and Budget Committee exists. So a whole bunch of questions about the budget. The Oakton corridor, I read a few days ago that it's going to be 16% over budget. What does that mean? I don't know how much the budget is for the Oakton corridor. How much in dollars and cents is that over budget? I understand that there's going to be, that City Evanston is going to have to replace a park over at Fleetwood Jourdain. And how much is that going to cost the city? Last council meeting 2 weeks ago, it looks like we passed about 22 million in general obligation bonds. And I'm wondering why. If we have this surplus, why do we need, we constantly are borrowing money. General obligation bonds is just a normal thing that, you know, we have now we owe over $100 million in general obligation bonds. Really. Last year we paid $15 million just in debt service, okay? That's 1.2 million per month we're paying in debt service. Do we need 100 million in general obligation bonds? Where am I at? What are we going to do with the service center, with the civic center, here? I mean, last I heard from Laura Biggs, she said that the windows needed to be replaced because they weren't caulked, and so just the general maintenance on the civic center is not being done. So now we want to tear down the civic center and do what? What are we going to do with Harley Clark? Okay, we are giving away money constantly. Valley gets $2 million. Chicago and Howard gets $2 million. Soul and Smoke was at $650,000. There, over by me on Dempster, there was Chicken and Waffle. They gave $250,000 to. They closed within a year or two, and then Kabul House moved in, but we gave them $50,000. Okay, this just. Do the taxpayers have any say-so in the money that we are giving away, millions and millions of dollars? Studies and consultants, consistently, we're paying for studies and consultants. I don't get it. We have 850 employees, but we need constantly to hire studies, consultants. Fountain Square, we paid $7 million for, and it doesn't work, okay? James Park, $8 million for a lawsuit. And people ask me, why am I bringing this up? This is years ago, because how is this rectified at all? I mean, you know, the thing in Fountain Square, it's ongoing. It still doesn't work. So I understand there's a lawsuit on that. Okay, skate park, $7 million. Animal shelter, $8 million. New school, how much is it going to cost? New park, city hall repair. Like Mary said, we need to get
So
that.
Ray, good thoughts, if you could wrap it up. Maybe,
Sure.
in a-
We need
30
to get
seconds or
our
so.
budget under control. It's out of control. Spending's out of control. General obligation bonds, TIF funds, borrowing money. We need to get this under control. It's out of hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Okay. Next. Yep, Mr. Schoolmaster.
Good afternoon, Timothy Schoolmaster from the Police Pension Fund. Board and Council has been researching mostly exclusively outside of the city, the PPRT aspects going back to the 70s. Some of this has been through FOIA, mostly outside. And today, sorry Hitesh, This is not a FOIA request. Tasha's received a request to see all his records on the PPRT, which is a provision of the pension code. I'm glad this is a code thing, which we have subpoena power on that. We could have hearings, we can subpoena records and people, because I'm astounded at some of my other FOIA requests, the city denial of documents that I've seen and held with my own hands, and demonstrably false statements made to the Attorney General of the state of Illinois when I question those. So hopefully, we want to find out what PPRT money was received by the city and where it went. It's the fund was one of the intended recipients, and we'd like to make sure that was all done on the up and up. I hope we can find something to help the effort, and I'm glad we found all this other money as well. Thank you.
Okay, doesn't look like anybody else in the room. Online? Clayton, any idea?
Darlene, would you like to speak?
Is Darlene on mute, or maybe it's not going to say anything?
Darlene's on mute. She's here online.
Right.
Okay. She's the only, or that is the only name that we see in the feed, other than
Okay.
Councilmember Burns, Councilmember Reed.
Who is William Otter? Oh, okay. Got it. Okay. Very good. Thank you. Thank you for those comments. So let's go through the approval of the minutes for both March 14th and then the follow-up meeting we had on the 21st. With respect to the 14th, does anyone have any comments with respect to those minutes? Okay.
No comments. I'll move approval of the March 14th minutes.
Okay. Go to roll call.
Councilmember Nusma?
Aye.
Councilmember Wynn? Councilmember Burns?
Aye.
Councilmember Reed?
Aye.
Councilmember Kelly?
Aye.
Committee Member McMillan? Committee Member Rikus?
Aye.
Chair Livingston?
Aye. Okay, and then for the March 21st minutes, any comments?
I move approval.
Councilmember Nusma?
Aye.
Councilmember Wynn? Councilmember Burns?
Aye.
Councilmember Reed?
Aye.
Councilmember Kelly? Committee Member McMillan? Committee Member Rikus?
Aye.
Chair Livingston?
Aye. Okay. So Councilmember Reed is on the phone now, right? He had asked that, so it looks like we can go in order and
Well,
discuss.
I'm about 3 minutes out. I'd love if I could be there in person for the next item. So if we can juggle that around still. I'd
Oh,
appreciate
okay.
that.
Sure. So you're on your way in? Got it.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Very good then. All right. Okay. So before we get into the overview of the general fund revenues, which we need to, and sort of how that cascades into the current estimates with respect to both 22 and 23, I would like to say something, because there's been some back and forth on emails, and I would like to clarify, and maybe if Councilmember Kelly has a different view, we could discuss this, but there has been some back and forth with respect to what does, and we'll have more of a pension discussion later, what does full funding of pension mean? And I would like to say what I think it means, okay? If you have a different view, you can say what you think it means, but I would just like to clarify my position, because I think there's a lot of back and forth where we believe we're in the same, I believe we're in the same sort of position. So just very briefly, so I can clarify my position and how this goes into the budget. So if we look at 2021, our police and fire gross liability, there's two things here. We have a liability, we have an asset number. Our gross liability was $467 million. Our assets were about $300 million, $297 million, 64% funded. That's where we were per the last actuary reports that we had, okay? We should get the 2022 reports, I think, over the next couple of months. It's unfortunate that it's on that degree of delay. But to look at where we are in '22, I think, first, there's two things that happened with respect to '22 relative to '21 that I think helps scope this for people. We had obviously about a 15% decline in asset values, something in that order. I don't have the final number. So that means our net of payments, our assets likely went from about 297 to 260. Our liabilities, as I would roll them forward with service cost and whatever, are probably in like the 483 range. So I think that really driven by the 15% loss between the two funds, we're likely at around 54%, but again, we're going to get the final reports. That would be my estimate, that we're at 54%. But also, more importantly, relative to really what we're asking Foster and Foster to look at and where our real starting place is, we also have the new public safety contracts, which are undoubtedly above trend with what was assumed in developing the projections for what the liabilities were. So, and I imagine that's one thing that Foster and Foster is having to, we'll take some more work to try to estimate what's the degree of the increase in the liability with respect to those new public safety contracts. But that likely knocks off another couple of points of funding because the liability is growing. So probably somewhere a bit over $500 million gross liability. Asset values maybe at about 260. So let's say we're about 50%, 51% funded. So that's how I view the starting place. And I think we would all agree, especially going from 64 to 54 and maybe 51 with the increase in the contracts. None of us like to see that. That's not acceptable. That's not what any of us would call full funding. Okay. What I view as full funding is as we roll these projections on the gross liability forward to 2040, which is our target time to be at full funding, as we roll those forward, and Foster is doing this work, but on the back of the envelope sort of view that I would take, our gross liability, not the net liability, is going to be about $1 billion, roughly in that sort of range. But they'll do the real calculation, and clearly my number is not exactly right, but the gross number is about $1 billion, which means we want to contribute sufficiently that our assets at that time, with earnings, net of payments, are about $1 billion, right? To me, that is full funding. Full funding is over this path, and that's why I continue to say it is a path that we are on to get our assets to grow from something like 260 to something on the order of $1 billion by 2040, if that liability is also in the range of 2040. And Foster will do additional work to validate their view on what the present value of the liabilities are by 2040. And I'm sure they'll come up with a different number. And whatever, they're the experts. All I've been able to do is my own sort of rough estimation. But to me, the bottom line point is full funding, as when I talk about full funding, and Councilmember Kelly, I'm interested in your view on full funding if it is different. My definition of full funding is by a certain target date, the present value of our liabilities equals the current value of our assets. That is 100% funding, and it is a path because the liabilities are affected by a lot of things, somewhat independently of funding, right? The liabilities are affected by mortality, lifespan. The liabilities are affected by pay rates. They're affected by inflation. They're affected by the discount rate that we assume on our asset returns. But Foster and Foster doing their best to say, what do we think at our target date the liability is? And then what are the required contributions with earnings, net of payments, that get us to a matching amount? And to me, that is the definition of full funding. A date in the future when our liabilities equal our assets. And until we get there, we're playing catch up, right? And I think that We'll see what those contributions are. But I think we need to understand what those are and build into our budget a path to funding those. And I think also a funding policy statement that says, as we deplete excess reserves, which is good that we have, maybe we'll be able to forecast that we're always going to have excess reserves. I don't think so. But what is our funding policy so we make sure that we stay on the required contribution path to get to our target funding level by 2040 of 100%. And my concern is that our current payments are about $26 million a year, right? So if we're putting $25 million in, but current payments are 26, it's difficult to materially shrink that difference between our current assets and liabilities. So it's critical that we get from the experts, Foster and Foster, their views on what the required contributions are so that our assets and liabilities match each other by our target date, which is 2040. So that is my thought. That is my, what I would consider full funding. And I think there's been some, Councilmember Kelly, if you view full funding as something different, I'd be interested in your views.
Well, I think it's somewhat vague what you've said. I mean, I understand your point. There's that path, we can get to that full funding. We have to. We're legally obligated by 2040. It's not like to get to that 100%, I mean, we have no choice. It's whether or not we want to saddle our future Evanstonians with yet even greater pension obligation and deficit. And so I don't. Are you interested in reducing that each year or not?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the way that we do that is what we did this year. And so I advocate that we continue on that path. If you fund less at 90%, that will continue to increase. And that is, this is what happened to Chicago. They did the same thing that Evanston has been doing for a long time now, but they said, and we've heard this here from staff, but we're doing even better than what the requirement is. The requirement's 90%. And that was a fraud for the Chicagoans because they kept putting that out like, we're putting down even more than what's required. And what ended up now is that Chicago is in a big mess, just as we are, with an incredible pension obligation. So what I'm saying is we should not continue underfunding, which is what we've been doing, and you're suggesting that maybe we will load on future Evanstonians that if you want to decrease the debt, we have to continue with what is, and I have the numbers here right now from Foster and Foster, what it would cost to do this again this year, to continue to make a dent in our obligation. And this is the most important thing we can do to protect property taxes in this town. Right now, this is it. I've talked to past Governor Quinn. He said this is exactly what we did this year is what we need to continue to do. And I'm sorry if you differ on that.
Okay. I don't hear any difference at all. Absolutely. I think we need to be prepared that the number is going to be, and we need to find a path to fund materially higher numbers than 25. And that's why we need a funding policy.
Right, so that's what we should do tonight. And we've put this off for too long, David. I wanted us to do this 2 months ago, and I hope that tonight we can at least approve policy that we put the full PPRT towards our pension. I would ask that tonight we vote on that to direct staff that 100% of the PPRT that's coming in here for the next, I would say, on into the future, 100% of the PPRT goes to our pensions. I think that's a starting place, and I hope that tonight we can vote on that to direct staff to put 100% of that.
I think that can be memorialized in an eventual funding policy that we can say what are all the elements of. So let's continue on the agenda. I think, can we agree? When we say full funding, we're talking about a date in the future where our assets equal our liabilities. Is that correct? And that we will define what contributions are necessary, and we will update that regularly to stay on that path.
Not increasing our overall obligation, because you can get to that point, increasing your obligation, and then pay more in the future. I don't want to increase the debt on the shoulder of our residents anymore. I want to start to decrease that. Okay. We did it this year. This was historic. We need to continue on that path. And I do have the projections
point of order. I just want to note for the chair that I flipped my light on. This is new, I think, being in this room for us.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Right. Sorry. Okay. All right. So, Councilmember Reed.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt, Councilmember Kelly. I think, just made to, I think the temperature's getting a little hot here. And I think there's agreement. What I'm hearing is agreement on the definition. And Councilmember Kelly, I think the slight difference or disconnect is, and I share this definition, I think, with Councilmember Kelly, which is that I think in our view, in my view, full funding, yes, is your definition, but also on an annual basis, making sure that we're making the contribution to get to that number that you're saying where our assets and our liabilities are. Am I mischaracterizing something? I think that's a shared definition, and that's where I am. And I think Councilmember Kelly's proposal is worth discussion when we get to that point, as how to get to the point where our assets and liabilities match at some point in near 2020, 2040. But I appreciate your definition. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Any other comments? Okay, we can get back. Okay. Ms. McMillan. Yeah.
I think what we're talking about is the difference in, I mean, we all want to get, we have to get to full funding. So we can all say full
You're going to use your microphone?
But we can all say full funding, but what I think Councilmember Kelly's trying to get at is the path we use to get there. And that's where we're going to have, I think that's where the work is going to be. And, and trying to provide the least amount of burden via either bonding or increased tax levies is what we should be working towards. And I think the other thing we need to think about with pension obligations is they're an obligation. Building a animal shelter, is not an obligation. That's not something you have to do. So I think in the taxpayers' minds and the council members' minds, I think you need to sort of say that's one bucket. I mean, that's sort of separate and apart from anybody else. That's what you've got to do. And if you're going to do tax increases or levy increases or bonds, then you need to tie those to discretionary items, I guess would be one of the things I'd like us to talk about.
All right. So maybe we can get back to the agenda. I wanted to get that in front. I think we have clarity. We both want the numbers. We all want the numbers. We need an expert to give us the numbers. And we want to stick to that path. And it's likely an increasing path. And we'll just have to deal with it. Right?
So
we'll have to come up with a funding policy and deal with it.
Right, but I do want to say we should give that direction sooner than later. And
And-
I don't think we should keep kicking this can down, David. We should, like, for example, directing, I think we could decide this evening that we want to put 100% of the PPRT towards pensions. That's what the PPRT is meant for by the state, and it has not been going. And I also want to say I did get, I asked some board members from the fire pension, and I did, Foster & Foster did give an estimate of what they would see. It's about a 3.7% increase. Total that the city would owe based on everything from, reduced number of employees to increased salaries and everything else that goes into the actuarial accounting. And so I can tell that it's going to probably be about $1 million more than what we paid last year. And so I don't see any reason why we have to continue to wait and wait and wait. We have all kinds of other numbers that come up that are way off, like we go from 14 million surplus to 34. And I mean, why we can't take the responsible measure now, or certainly no later than May, in directing staff how we're going to fully fund.
So I would suggest in May, let's try to limit our discussion to 2 items. A revised forecast for the current year, maybe 3 items. A retrospective on what happened in '22, right, with where we were at the budget time to the final. Okay, what revenues changed and why? An updated view based on everything we know on '23, and let's discuss the pension and potentially vote on the pension then of our recommendation. But I think longer term, and what we might take several months to do, is really come up with a formal funding policy. It doesn't have to be multiple pages, but that goes through how we think the Evanston going forward should think about pension contributions, how they define what those are. Use excess reserves up to X. Use the full amount of PPRT to the degree that's appropriate. I think there's a minor issue that PPRT is supposed to be spent partially relative to what it was historically, but most of that was pensions. Maybe it's 80%, whatever it is. What's the legal what's the legal requirement relative to PPRT? Most of it is pensions. I don't think it's all pensions, but that's a minor sort of item. So let's put that in a document. That would be great to have the council vote on, so that when the Evanston, when we get to the days, inevitably, in a recession or whatever, where the reserves are gone and people have to make tough funding choices, we already have an agreed document on what we would do. And certainly that council could disregard it or vote to do something different, but I think we create a better hurdle to commit them to stay on this path by coming up with a formal funding document and say, this is what we thought, this is how it should be treated. Mr. Desai has recommended we do that. Again, this is not a 20-page document. I think it's a bit where the Blue Ribbon Committee report fell short. They did not define that. So I think we need to define that better, of what we think when the day comes that we need incremental revenues, what those are. And they can be whatever, right? They can be whatever. I am, historically, and we'll go through this, a large part of the pension contribution was funded by property taxes. It doesn't have to be that way. But let us define, let's do that hard work now, so that we make sure the city is as committed as it can be, again, they could undo it, to stay on this path and where the revenues will come from.
Can we include in that, David, sort of hierarchy of payments, sort of our own Maslow's curve of our pyramid of what we fund first, and that this is at the top?
So I think part of that's a question for Mr. Desai, but I would say, yeah, let's do our best to define how we would expect the future to act, how different, older people, we thought about it and this is what we would do and this is what this council passed. And if you want to change it, there's a hurdle there.
Yeah.
But Leslie's point is that is for us to decide. If we, it's not something, right.
Absolutely.
Right.
So again, I think we are all in agreement. If we are faced with higher contributions required, let's say what we would want to do now and define that. Use as much PPRT. I think no one's going to disagree with that. If there's a legal requirement that it can't be 100%, let's understand what that is, right?
The question is whether, have we been spending it legally in the past?
Yeah, I think by convention.
Yeah, if there was a leak here.
It's meant for pensions.
Yeah, okay. And we
Or
need to
debt,
reimburse, then
or
let's
debt, but we haven't
reimburse, right? I mean, at a time that we have excess reserves, right? So again, I don't think we have any big disagreements as to how we see things, and what we want to do. And I think we want to commit as much as we can to the future to stay to this path in a way that is the least painful as possible. Granted that there will be pain. If we have to grow the assets 4 times the liabilities, there's some trade-offs there, right? So let's get back to the agenda, but I wanted to get that out there and sort of make sure that we identified any difference. Okay.
It's going to be in the details.
So now, and let's, Councilmember Kelly, if you don't mind, let's limit the meeting in May to those subjects. And let's think about what we can make a recommendation relative to next year's budget, fine. But we want to do a funding policy that's probably going to take more than a month. Okay. Yeah, well, we can say we want to fund it. But let's think about what that is. We can take care of the short term and the long term by developing a formal funding policy statement that Mr. Desai can help us pull together. Maybe if there are relevant documents from other communities as to what they've had done. And we try to make it flexible, but we do our best to commit. So let's get back to the agenda, but I think this relates to the agenda as well. And so we are on the overview of the general fund revenues, right? On, I'm sorry. We're back to
David?
transportation infrastructure. Yeah.
Oh, David and
Yes.
Sherry on Zoom here. I forgot who I'm with. Is someone with me on the pensions? Because I think I was supposed to be the liaison with pensions.
It's sort of you and me.
Okay. So maybe we should dig deeper in between the meeting, and then Claire, one of us can meet with you, because I know we can't have a full meeting, but I think we should do some work before the meeting than to just have it all come up at the meeting. So I'm happy to dig a little deeper and work on this in between the meeting.
Great idea. Okay. So, all right, yeah, so we're going back then to the Transportation Infrastructure Enterprise Fund referral from Councilmember Reed.
Thank you. So I will move discussion. Thank you. Okay, I will kick us off here. I made this referral a while ago in response to a Supreme Court decision that came down in, I believe, early 2022. And that Supreme Court decision was a case brought by the Illinois road workers against the County of Cook, and they claimed that Cook County was in violation of the Illinois Constitution there was a constitutional amendment, I believe, in 2016, 2017, that said that all state funds must be, all transportation-related funds must be spent on transportation-related expenses. It's the Transportation Lockbox Amendment, if folks remember. And when this was passed, there was an understanding. In fact, I remember reading in the court case, in the decision, that the legislators, that are state representatives and state senators, believed that this would not apply to municipalities, that this would only apply to the state. But the court said, hey, the law is the law. It's in the Constitution. It says that all transportation-related funds must be spent on transportation-related expenditures. And that's the case for the state, and that's also the case for municipalities, because nowhere in home rule authority does the state grant a municipality powers that the state doesn't have itself. And that was the Supreme Court's logic. Or municipalities, or, in this case, the County of Cook. So with that, I believe it's mandate that we should be following similar accounting standards. And, this isn't going to change a whole lot about what's happening here. It's really going to change things on paper and make tracking easier. My suggestion is that we would create a transportation enterprise fund, and all transportation-related revenue would go into this line item or this fund or whatever. Mr. Desai can speak to that better. But it would go into this transportation enterprise fund, and all expenditures would also be noted in that same fund. And so, as is mentioned here in the memo, if you look at Cook County's budget document, you'll see that there they have a transportation fund. They show what the revenues are, what the various revenues for it, and then they show what the expenditures are. The county doesn't maintain a lot of roads like we do, so their expenditures are different. I do want to be clear that when I say transportation-related, expenditures, that also does include enforcement. So that does mean that, we can use some of this money to fund the police department, particularly the traffic division, and other, again, transportation-related expenditures that aren't just repairing the roads. Why is this important? This is important because it makes sure, again, we have a $100 million unfunded infrastructure liability. We need to make sure that we're making an investment year after year in our transportation infrastructure and making sure that we bring that number down. Also, it's important on the flip side to make sure that we're not relying on usually regressive sources of revenue to fund areas outside of transportation. And what we've seen from this is the County of Cook recently, I think it may have been clever marketing, but they got rid of their wheel tax. And I'd say it's because they don't need the revenue. They can't find a way to spend it with the new transportation. But, they claim it's regressive, the wheel tax. And so, there's a fee that has been lessened on, certain residents in Cook County. And so I think, this is good because it makes sure that we're spending on transportation. It's good because it makes sure that we're not overcharging residents for fees and fines and services that maybe we're using that excess revenue to fund things not related. And so it's really a mandate. I think this is the way we clean it up. I will end there and take any questions. And just really quick, I'll note, what are the funding sources? It's in the memo, but, the parking tax, wheel tax, annual parking permits, visiting permits, truck permits, boot release fees, various tickets and fines for parking, the auto rental tax. So those are the funds that would go into this lockbox, if you will.
Anyone have any questions? Oh, Councilmember Kelly.
So can you talk a little bit about how those funds are dispersed now?
It's they go into the general fund, so there isn't really a clear accounting of exactly where they go, except for the parking fund, which is its own kind of enterprise fund, and so there is that's separated out from the general fund.
Can I ask Mr. Desai a question? How much, if we have to use these revenues for these expenses, do you believe that we're already sufficiently spending in these areas that would you know? I mean, if we're already spending
Thank you.
15,
and I
you know?
I'm a little bit under the weather, so I would let Clayton kind of speak to the
Okay.
details about the memo.
Okay, sure.
I can take a crack at that. When I initially, and Clayton, please chime in as well, but when I initially made this referral, I did some back of the napkin math that has been verified by this memo, so I feel good about it. But I estimated that we were bringing in about $10 million in annual revenue between all of those sources, and I believe I could, when I was going through the budget, that I could find just under or just at about $10 million in expenditure. And I did not include the police department. So, but if you're talking just infrastructure and road improvements on an annual basis, we were spending just under $10 million on that. So certainly, can we justify spending, the $10 million in revenue on, I'm not saying we're breaking the law. I'm saying we're very likely doing the right thing, but I think for accounting purposes and for transparency and to make sure that we are following this, it makes sense, because there's a lockbox amendment, to create somewhat of a lockbox within our reporting structure, so it's very clear, that the money coming in is going out to appropriate sources.
I can speak to it just a little bit more too, because we did do a little bit of crunching on the general fund to establish a number. As you mentioned earlier, Councilmember Reed, the state amendment it opens the door to being able to use these funds for public safety and enforcement of traffic laws. In our patrol operations alone, the salaries for our patrol division is about $11 million. So they largely cover it. We also have about $4 million in the Public Works Department salaries, folks that maintain roads, transportation, traffic signal, and streetlights. Probably another $1 million in the parking enforcement folks. They're budgeted in the general fund. We purchase $1 million worth of vehicles, give or take annually, that we also use to maintain streets. Another $1 million or so in fleet division salaries for folks that maintain those vehicles. So we can, with the $11 million in revenue, the expenses exist. It would just really be an exercise to track them in a separate fund.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate Councilmember Reed's bringing this to our attention. I don't know what you do when you go home at night, but I think you must read the congressional record in your free time, or the legislative record. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing this to our attention. In addition to having a council member flag this to our attention, I am also curious if the Municipal League or the City Managers Association has weighed in on this and provided any guidance to municipalities.
There hasn't been communities where I worked previously. We didn't respond to this, and I think the main reason for that too is following the Supreme Court decision, and we detail it in the memo. There was some additional judicial procedures where Cook County put this money towards public safety, and the Illinois Road Builders Association took issue with that. And so that process is still sort of working itself out.
Yeah.
There may be more to come on the judicial front. So I think that's probably one reason why communities haven't rushed to respond
Right, so
to that one decision.
Right. So I have a question about the sense of urgency, and if policy requirements are still in the process of being sorted out, I don't want to take action before we know what and if we should be doing. So that's one question I have. I also have a question with regards to the scope and to the extent to which parking is included. Is it? It seems like it should be, but parking wasn't mentioned in the article that you forwarded. So just a question about the scope here. And then a question, I think, which has already been answered maybe about the implementation. If we're already kind of in compliance just for all the expenses you just mentioned, which did not include any capital expenses, right? If we're already meeting the obligations that we assume we're going to be under here, does it help or does it hurt to set up a separate fund? And that's a question for Tesh or for you. Does that make your life easier? Does it make your life harder if we have a separate fund?
From our perspective too, the good news about parking is it's already tracked in its separate enterprise fund. So we're already tracking those revenues sort of as an enterprise. In terms of another fund, we have 39 funds right now, and all 39 of those funds have their own restrictions as to how you can use the money that goes into those funds. So this would be a 40th fund with very specific revenues for very specific purposes. We can create it. It's another fund, and we have plenty and have great experience tracking very special purpose funds. We have an MFT, a sustainability. This would probably be very similar to those types of funds. So it would just be an exercise to create that additional fund.
So can I ask, though, do we know, is this settled law yet?
So from my research, certainly there are, as Clayton mentioned, there are things that are still out there about, how much can you spend, how can you justify, for example, the county is spending money on the juvenile court system and traffic and other things. And so there still is some unsettled law regarding the use for public safety, but it's very clear, I think, from the Supreme Court case and from what has transpired thus far, that municipalities are required, just like the state, to create, to make sure that, all transportation-related revenue is going toward transportation-related expenditures. So there must be a transportation lockbox.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
Well, and I guess that's the question, right? Is the law that we have a transportation lockbox, or is the law that we use funds in that amount for that purpose?
Sure, that is the law, but I think, and if I can respond to your question and to what Clayton was saying, I mean, for you all, a new fund is essentially just a line on a piece of paper, and so I don't think that creating a new fund would, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but be some hard task. The only thing is just juggling around where these things land on the budget, so it's very clear. If anyone, if the state or the Road Workers Association or some union takes issue with Evanston, they can very clearly look at our budget, say, hey, they bring in $10 million in transportation-related revenue, and here from this fund, they're clearly spending, at least or more than that $10 million in transportation. So it's just really, you asked about the urgency. Does it help or hurt? It certainly doesn't hurt. It helps, if anything. I think it just is transparency for our residents, transparency for any naysayer out there who may want to bring a similar lawsuit against Evanston, to very clearly be able to look at our budget and say, yeah, they're doing the right thing.
If I could, I think we should be sensitive to, there is an element of accounting complexity, but it might not be that much. I would encourage, I think we've talked before that 40 funds or 39 funds, if we were to benchmark that against other communities, might be a lot of funds already. And I think maybe as part of this, if we're thinking about establishing another fund, all the funds are actually listed on the last page of this deck because of the budget amendment. Do we need all the, if we're going to add one, maybe there's 5 we can drop, right? Because we do, a fund does trap money in a use, right? And maybe they're all required,
Yeah, we've spoke about it a bit. There are a couple, and many of the ones that exist are created at the direction of City Council, things like the Sustainability Fund and others. It's been the desire to track it there. The TIFs, the SSAs, those have to maintain their own fund. The enterprise funds, the water, the sewer, the solid waste, and the parking, have to maintain those as separate funds. Where we do have some flexibility is in our internal service funds, like fleet and equipment replacement. We talked about maybe combining those, but that was about as far as we could get with quickly and easily and efficiently consolidating a fund. There may be other opportunities that we haven't explored yet.
And
but.
point of information, because the parking is a part of this, and I hear what you're saying, but I do think what I remember reading is, I mean, it's clearly related to transportation. You're taking the car and you have to put it somewhere. But we would need a parking fund because it would be a part of the transportation enterprise fund.
Parking seems like it should be, but it's not explicitly stated in anything that I've read, so it's just a question mark for me. So I guess my position here is...
Oh, well, if I can note, the county, if you look at the county budget, on page 57, as was noted in the here, they include parking in their enterprise, their transportation.
We already have a parking fund. So since we're already in compliance with our preliminary understanding of the law, I don't think we need to take any immediate action here is kind of my sense. Let's see what the policy, what the law kind of settles out to be. Wait for some guidance from IML and other sources.
We have spoken with Corporation Counsel, and I think the extent to which we've done that is he said that the Supreme Court decision applies to us. We're home rule, but we have to comply with the amendment. We're not immune to it. But again, we haven't gotten in like a really deep conversation. We've gotten IML guidance in Northwest Municipal. We haven't really seen anybody else doing it yet. So
if at some point in the future it makes sense to, or we have to have a separate fund, let's do it then. But I don't think we need to take action at this point.
If I may, Chair, respond. I don't think we should wait. I think that waiting puts us potentially, I mean, we can calculate the risk, it's probably pretty low, but if Cook County had a transportation enterprise fund already, right, they were already complying essentially with the law. They were in the same boat that we're in now. And if they had done the accounting ahead of time, God knows how much money they spent on taking this all the way up to the Supreme Court and fighting the road workers union. They wouldn't have to spend that money and waste taxpayer money on defending a case and, then retroactively going back and proving the accounting. We should just do it up front. We know that we are mandated by state law, by the Illinois Constitution, to have, to make this expenditure, and it was called the Transportation Lockbox Amendment. Let's just create the line item. Let's avoid the potential of being a part of some new lawsuit or some class action that the road workers file against a bunch of municipalities. Let's inundate ourselves from that and just change a few lines on a piece of paper, and then we know that we're safe moving into the future. And it's just for transparency for our residents, so they know that, when we're raising potentially, parking fees or other costs, they can see exactly where that money is going, and knowing that we're not doing it to cover some mistake that we made somewhere else or, some expenditure that we made somewhere else, that it's going toward its purpose, which is transportation.
So this was just a discussion item in the agenda, I think, and I think we know where we are. We can, like I said earlier, I would love for the May meeting to just be on these 3 subjects of 22 actual, 23 forecast, and pension. So maybe we could talk about it more, or if there's any additional developments, talk about it in June.
I would love to move that we bring this back. You said the May meeting you want to have
just those 3 subjects.
Yeah, so then
can we talk about it in June?
Yeah, so
Right?
I'd like to
with
move
everyone?
that we bring this back in June with,
Yeah.
as for action.
I'd like to have some additional input
Yeah, no, and with that input, I think all of that should come back in June with our legal department, with, some communication with IML and others. And, let's just bring it back as a policy. And so I move that we bring this back in June for action, and we can make the decision then to table it or whatever. But that's my motion.
If we can discuss that motion.
Can someone second it?
Let's discuss it.
I looked on the IML website this afternoon and didn't find anything related to this topic. I don't know if they have a timeline, if they're planning to weigh in here. If that doesn't not happen by June, I don't want to box ourselves into a corner here.
Yeah, I'll just say that, IML is very useful, but, there are plenty of things that we're doing here that IML doesn't give guidance on.
Or ICMA, or the ICLT, or anything.
And this is a fairly new thing, as I mentioned. I happened to come across this doing research for reparations, and that's how I came across this. This is a pretty, obviously IML would have their eyes on something like this, but this is pretty, novel. This is not something that was talked about widely, so I wouldn't expect that there would be huge discussion on this yet. But there's a second to the motion, and I would appreciate a vote on bringing it back in June.
If I could just maybe one other, maybe the council members could just offline discuss if June's the right, if we have new information, we talk about it in June. Would that, we can add it to the agenda in June if there's something to talk about. And maybe the council members could just decide, do they want this on the agenda in June? Would that be okay? I mean, we will talk about it, but if you guys want to talk about it.
Yeah, I stand by the motion. My apologies. But I think that's important. If for some reason, I think we'll have more information by June. We'll have, the motion is asking staff to, by June, have conversations with IML, to have the law department look at this further. This is something Nick and I have, Council Cummings and I have discussed previously. I think we can get that feedback that you're looking for by June, and maybe even have someone from the county who's been close to this. In fact, the county budget manager, who I think the council members are familiar with, I had a conversation with the county budget manager about this very this law, and so I think we can get some of that feedback as well.
If we don't have the information by June, we can hold it.
Yeah, if we don't have it, we can hold it and table it.
So do we have a second? To have it in June? Okay. So we have a second to talk about this in June. Well,
I don't know if we.
or do we just voice vote? That's fine.
Yeah, we can
all
voice
disagree.
vote.
We'll do that. We'll do that. Okay. Fine. We'll put it on the agenda in June.
Voice vote is
Aye. June.
all
June.
those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those in
Okay.
favor?
Aye.
Okay.
I'll say no on principle, but I'm
Okay.
totally willing to go along.
All right. Got it. Okay. Okay. So we're going to talk about the general fund revenues in a couple of pages here on the budget. Clearly, there has been some, based on late recovery of some revenues above forecast, there's been some growth. There was some growth in the 22 actuals, as people have noted, that we have a current year surplus now of $26.3 million, which is good at one level, but probably absolutely should have had, well, to the degree it would have been possible. It would have been good to have better visibility with respect to that in the budget process. So let's, in light of that 26 million current, I think actually we might be out of order here. Whichever page you want to go to next, Clayton, be it the general fund revenues page or the general fund forecast page. This just shows.
All right, yeah, so I can jump right in with the presentation. Mr. Desai is not feeling well, so he's given the mic to me for the evening. So this is just the forecast. We showed it last month. It hasn't changed much from what you saw. Last month we walked through the $26 million surplus as you highlighted. That continues to be shown here in the 22 year to date, and we continue to begin the audit annual closeout process, and so we're sitting at this $26 million surplus for FY22, $26 million. Looking at the second slide, we've talked about this already last month, so we talked about potential uses for that surplus and expenses. Some of these have already been approved. To date, we've approved $15.5 million in use of that surplus in order to balance the general fund, cover overages on 3 capital projects. Last night, the Oakton corridor was included and approved using a portion as well, and then $3 million for police and fire. And then we've already talked a bit about some of these other potential uses moving forward. This item was focused on these general fund revenues, so that's kind of where we want to spend the conversation, giving you a 5-year look back at some of the major revenues and give you an idea of our budget for 23. Shown here are 18 individual revenue sources. These 18 revenues comprise 80% of general fund revenues, so they cover a vast majority of the movement that you see from year to year in terms of total city general fund revenues. The other line at the bottom includes 107 individual line items, but again, those are only 20% of our budget. So these are the ones we look at whenever we talk about where, when surpluses happen. It's generally a result of the revenues pictured here. Highlighting just a couple of them, and this is in your packet. It's on the third slide. I know the numbers are probably really hard to see up on the screen. But it's starting with the...
I'm sorry, the one that I'm looking at in the packet on page 15 of 22, it seems like something's cut off on ours. Is that?
There was an email sent out that slightly adjusted this page to put on pension and to put in the all other general and fund.
Okay.
So there was an email sent that added apologies for that, but we thought it would be a better presentation to reconcile to the other page. And
Check the email. It's there.
yeah.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
So highlighting just a few of these, the state income tax in the first line, this is the largest general fund revenue outside of the pensions. The IML estimate when we developed the budget was about $139 to $158 per capita. It's currently $155 per capita, so this is one of those mini revenues that we get estimates from the IML in order to budget for. If the current trend of $155 per capita holds, we could see about a $500,000 in upside from our budget of $11.5 million.
I'm sorry, is this in our packet?
Can you
Is it?
point the
No,
mouse
that's
to
not
the
it.
line we're talking about?
That's not that.
This was in the email that adjusted this page slightly.
So it's not.
It's in our
Well,
packet.
most of
but
it is in the packet. It's just there's some line items on the
That
bottom
pages.
that were not. But these primary streams that account for 80 of the revenue, that was in the original.
If you follow the mouse here, this that I'm outlining is included in the packet. We added the 4 lines here at the bottom at the request today, so those are the only additions that were in today's revised version of the presentation.
And then can we make sure that, I think you were going to say this, can we make sure that this gets shared to the webpage so the public can have this full, okay.
Yeah,
And going
absolutely.
forward, I've asked this in the past too, we really should see adopted and actual. I think that's so important. So for example, when we're looking at 22 and then 23, that's just what we adopted, but 22 is actual. So I just think those columns really, we should always have the adopted and the actual. That gives us a much better picture as to what's going on, because the last column is just simply adopted, whereas the column before is what we ended up with, and we have no idea where that stands relative to what we actually adopted. So I've asked this before, so I would ask, going forward, if we could please have adopted and actual.
I will second that.
Is a good 22 reference what the forecast was at the time of the adoption of the 23 budget, rather than the original 22 budget? Because I think that's another relevant point, that when a forecast was given for 22 at the time of the adoption of the 23 budget, what was that? But we don't want to junk it up too much. If you want the original budget, we can put the original budget.
Projection. I mean, adopted revenue, an adopted budget for revenue is a projection, right? So that's what I'm asking for.
Makes sense, but
So we
pretty
wanna-
soon we're looking at 50 columns.
So be it 2 pages. I mean, you do it on 2 separate pages, but it's really, otherwise it's it's not giving us a very clear picture with only actual.
So, and not to belabor quicker, but the point 2 of the table in this exercise is to see where we finished 22 and what we budgeted for 23, so that we can, at this point, what we budgeted in 22, while important for some analysis, what's really important at this point is where did we actually finish 22, and are we wrong with our 23 budget based on where we finished 22? And so that's kind of where we're looking here. I mean, for state income tax at the top, we finished 22 at 12.8 million. We budgeted 11.5 million. So it's important that we kind of spot those differences. And so, but going down the list just a little bit more, I only have 4 other revenues on this that I would want to highlight. One is sales taxes. Budgeted in anticipation of some of the inflationary trends beginning to level off. As we saw at the end of 22, those remained very strong, and all indications are that those have carried into 23. So we could see another 2 to 3 million in upside between those two sales taxes. 22 is probably a bit high because we're assuming that a recession or something at some point tapers these off, and we begin to see them level off a bit. But even if we only get to 21 totals, you could still see about $2 to $3 million in upside for our sales taxes. The issue with trying to project at this point, we don't get January sales taxes until later this month, maybe in the next day or two, I would guess. And January and February are always the worst sales tax months because everybody spends all their money at Christmas. So you really don't start to get an idea of how our sales taxes are trending until July, August. But we can compare it against last year and make sure January, February start to come in similar to where we were last year whenever we saw 12.9 million record highs in both state and home rule sales taxes. Another one worth highlighting, I believe it's a miss, is recreation program fees. You can see we finished FY22 at 6.7 million, and we budgeted 5.3 million for FY23. I understand there were some turnover, both in our department and with the Parks and Rec department as well. There was a fee increase of 10% for non-residents last year on our programs, and so we generated a record high 6.7 million, which far exceeded even pre-pandemic levels, which wasn't making a whole lot of sense considering that, there was still some of the pandemic impacted programming going on. But I think this is one where we've definitely agreed there's probably about 1 million, 1.3 million in potential upside here as long as we keep those programs in place and they generate what we saw last year.
Or we could reduce fees
Or we could,
if we don't need the money.
correct, something to consider at some point too. Building permits, likely some upside here. 7 million was our actual in 22. We budgeted 4.2 million for 23. I caution here because community development has a lot of really small revenues as well. And we have some collaboration that needs to happen there to make sure that this 7 million is truly building permits and not something that goes into one of those other revenue accounts. And so that's something that we hope to clean up and have a better picture of in the next few months to make sure that that's tracking correctly. PPRT year to date is 960,000. You can see we bumped up the budget, or we finished last year at 5.5 million. This year's budget is 2.9 million. Our year to date is 960,000 through 2 payments. Last year at this point it was 1.5 million. So that's down 35% from last year's year to date. Now it's super early. I think we get our bigger payments a little later in the year in May, October, and December. So I think May will have a much better picture as to whether this 35% reduction from last year's actual is something that's going to hold in 23. And then one last one to highlight is the real estate transfer tax. So you can see our budget for that is 750,000. Our actual budget for that is 3.75 million. The 3 million that we've reallocated to the real estate or to the reparations fund. Even that revenue source last year, compared to last year, we're at 50% of where we were last year at this point in the year. So it's really dropped off quite a bit. But again, it just takes one really large office tower or retail building in order for this one to catch back up and get back on last year's trend.
Are there any that you think you're low on in terms of?
So the ones I mentioned, yeah, I think in total we at this very, very preliminary early stage, we could have about 6 million to 10 million in potential upside. I think this ties back to last year we finished with the $25 million surplus. I just rattled off the same revenues just now that contributed to that large surplus. So we still have some potential upside in our budget for 23. On the last slide, I talked about a handful of things that we have.
One quick question about this. With regard to the real estate transfer tax?
Yes.
So you're saying you took out from that line what we budget for because it's going to the reparations fund? I think that should still be reflected there even though it will be transferred.
So
I mean,
this
that's
is
misleading.
It's a general fund. The reparation, or the real estate transfer tax, as determined by our corporation council, had to be direct deposited into the reparations fund, so it's not actually a transfer.
But we should still
So
have a
this-
record of what we're getting from, I mean, what we're projecting for it. I don't think that should
We do
disappear.
maintain that record, but this table is showing just the revenues coming into the general fund.
No, I know, I understand that the transfer tax will go down this year. I'm not questioning that. So what did you say you budgeted for it?
3.75 million.
Okay, so we will see, where can we find that? Where do we see the other difference
If I
represented?
created a separate table showing revenues in the reparations fund, that would be shown on that.
And
that
so we
table.
would see how much represented there?
Yes, 3 million.
3 million, okay. And it'll say real estate transfer tax.
Same account, same code. It's very similar to pension and pension PPRT. Now, since both of those are in the general fund, I manipulated the data to be able to combine it into a single line so that it's not confusing and we're seeing the two separately. But it's very similar. It's the same revenue source, just different funds.
So I think bottom line, you're saying when we get to a May discussion on a revised outlook for the year, we could see $6 to $10 million more in revenues that offset some of the cost increases that we just, and I think, look, it's important to be conservative, but there's a tension about, being overly conservative, we don't want either, right? So I think it's good that with the additional tools that we have now, this table didn't exist, at least what I saw before last year. Really good work, Clayton and Hitesh to pull this together. It helps really clarify, what questions and perhaps areas of adjustment. So it's good. And so we'll get a new outlook in May. And then I would also say we should do another outlook in maybe September, before we go into budget season, and we'll look at what have been our trends. And so we have the most informed view of the current year activity to provide a basis for the 24 budget. So, we have some cost increases. It would be great if we have offsetting revenue increases, and we're still looking at about the same number that of the use of the excess reserves, or maybe less, right? So we'll just take a good view. So, and we'll just continue to refine the tools that we have to get the best ongoing forecast that we can. Okay? So, any other questions on this page?
No, but I would respectfully ask if we could have the adopted and the actual. And, if it means we transfer into two. I mean, side by side.
So
but-
to clarify, you're looking for the actual and adopted for each year shown in the table?
Yeah, so if we're going to go back to 2018, so it would be 2018 adopted, 2018 actual, 2019 adopted, 2019 actual.
So how about this? What if we did another page which shows all the budgets, and we have a third page that just shows the variance? That might be an easier way to look at it.
No, I'd like to see them side by side, the adopted and the actual.
Okay, so we can think about how to present that. We could have various versions of this.
It's
Right.
really, it's easy to drop in those numbers, so we can do that. Did you want to talk about the
Right.
next slide?
I think the next page, we talked about this in February. I just wanted to recap, and this goes back a bit to the budget discussion. Just this puts on one page. Look, what have the contributions been going from 18.8 to 25? What was the source? The source was almost exclusively property tax. So I guess we do have to ask the question on the PPRT. Should I don't know, what's the impact if some of the PPRT should have gone into here? I don't know, right? What's the impact of if we were all sort of property tax pension levy? We did have from other sources. I guess we could attribute the 23 budget to PPRT. But what do we need to think about with respect to how have we funded it? How should we have funded it? But by and large, it has been property tax pension levy that has been the source of most of our pension funding until 23. So the 23 number maybe catches up on some of the PPRT.
And I would just add one thing. When you say PPRT, if we give, say, 5 million, 4 million, whatever, we'll have to reduce the tax levy then. We cannot do double thing. I mean, it's
We have
very
to reduce
clear
the tax.
state
Okay,
law.
so we need to understand that, right?
So if their requirement is 10 million and you say, okay, 5 million of PPRT goes to the pension fund, then the tax levy goes down by that $5 million. It cannot be a double dipping. So it's clear there.
So we need to
Document, I think,
understand
which
that for our
document, I think,
pension
which I
discussion.
shared, with, I think, you and the Corporation Council, it says that.
Okay, so let's talk about that more in May, right? You're saying it's not incremental. PPRT is not incremental to a property tax levy. Okay, so we need to understand that. We need to understand that, all right? Okay. So, all right. So again, we'll get into this more in May. But again, I think everyone's in agreement. We will fully fund what Foster and Foster says for 24, through the established pension levy, appropriately through PPRT. But we got to figure out, is it incremental? Is it non-incremental? We're not in a position to cut the property tax levy at this point. And I would also, and you have it on your sheet, if the Foster and Foster numbers indicate a higher recommended contribution, we can make a higher recommended contribution off of the available excess reserves that currently exist for this year as well. So, this group is not looking for excuses to not fund, right? Let's fund what we need to fund, okay? All right, I think that is all that we planned on talking about relative to the overview of the general fund and then the general fund revenues, and Clayton, good job on that. So finally, then, we have the ordinance to true up some of the budget numbers with the actuals. And I think this is largely an administrative exercise. Clayton or Hitesh, if you want to go through this, but we need to amend the budget for 22 in light of the actual spending. And
Correct. I can give a
Ms.
quick.
McMillan, did you have a question?
Clayton, why don't you go first? I just have some questions on the wording.
In the amendment?
Yes.
Okay. Just a really brief overview. So I think you said it best when you said it's largely administrative in nature. We're not asking to spend anything. We're just really asking to true up some of the funds that we did spend. Of the 39 funds we mentioned, were expenses recorded last year. 15 had funds that went over budget. In the memo, we highlight the reasons for those over budget amounts. Many of those are the SSA funds, comprise 4 of those. Those are, the city serves as a pass-through for property taxes. So if we get more money in property taxes, we hand off more money over to those who manage the SSA. For the TIFs, there were some property purchases that were not budgeted, as well as some consulting services that were approved throughout the year and approved by city council that resulted in those going over budget as well. This year, for the first time, we're also including funds that were way under budget. 4 funds we're highlighting. Most of these funds, large budgeted expenses didn't materialize in 22, but they're being carried forward to 23. Those include ARPA, where we haven't spent all the money yet, so we're carrying forward whatever our fund balance is there. Our water intake project, a portion of that was budgeted last year. The full project is budgeted this year as well, so it didn't materialize as much as we budgeted. And then in the Affordable Housing Fund, I believe, in speaking with Ms. Sarah Flax, Community Development Director, there was a housing project that didn't materialize last year, but was approved last night, and so that's why this one was $1 million under budget last year as well. It offers a better explanation as to why our budget, by reducing those funds where we underspent, we're not artificially inflating our budget to a level that isn't accurate. So we've opted to include those in this year's amendment as well.
I have some questions on the wording. So one area you say if you've gone over, you have to amend you're required to, I'm sorry, I can't read with my glasses on, that you're required to amend the budget. If you're under, it says you can, if you'd like to. Have you done this before?
The city of Evanston is not, no. We've never done it before. There are other communities that do amendments, to their budgets, and they reduce when they don't spend, and so I think this is very similar to that. But Evanston is not.
Why are we doing it now? I'm just curious.
If we weren't doing it as part of this amendment, the recommendation would be to increase our 22 budget by about $2 million, which kind of artificially inflates our budget last year, because while we're increasing it by $2 million in order to comply with state law, we also underspent by several million in other funds too. So this is,
You go over in some? I apologize.
we went over
I'm
in
not following.
15. Yeah, the last page of the packet indicates those funds that went over budget in '22. So 15 were over, which means 24 were under, and of those 24 that were under, at least these 4 were significantly under for reasons that I mentioned.
I'm just curious to know, we haven't done this in the past, why are we doing it now? I don't really understand.
I mean, we haven't done it, but again, the kind of amount was involved, particularly with the ARPA and water, 37. And generally, I see the perception is even if we ask for a $2 million increase, that, okay, now the budget has gone from $300 and X dollars to this. In reality, and then we checked from the kind of a legal standpoint, whether we can do it. We checked with the auditors. They say, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's illegal. We checked with our corporation counsel. He was fine.
I'm curious, was this suggested you do this by the auditors?
Not suggested. This was our intent to kind of bring the true picture in front of the council and the people. And particularly the ARPA fund and water fund with almost $35 million reduced budget. We want to be kind of, put the right numbers out there. And again, we have left some room there while we work on the audit. So it's not exactly, water fund could be a little bit less, right, I guess?
Right. The water fund's like 17 million under. And we're
But you're right, to answer your question in short, has the Evanston done this before? No.
I don't think so.
But again, the auditors and corporation counsel says, we don't see anything illegal. So we move forward with, and again, you can recommend the other way, and the council can make the final decision.
So last year the 21 year staff overspent by 11.5 million and came to us before the audit. It's always like right before the audit to increase the 21 budget last year by 11.5 million, but it was okay because there was 31 million in surplus. So my question is, we're choosing now to reduce the budget rather than, and there was a lot of talk, and I held over that increase in order to get an assurance that going forward, when there was a projected overspending by fund, not within funds, but by whole fund, that we would first be, when possible, if it was an emergency, that finance and budget would be approached to overspend. So I also find this, I don't see any need to do this. Why wouldn't we simply do what we did last year, which is to adjust the budget by 2 million? It was overspent. The staff went over by 2 million. Why don't we simply adjust that? And then we have surplus.
I mean, it's not the kind of I would say the real surplus. The real surplus, what we say, like in general fund, when you say 23 million, is the actual revenue and actual expenditure. Yeah, budget to actual, we would look good that, okay, we spent 30 million less in water fund. Okay, let's spread us. Is that the right picture? No. And as I think we explained why it happened, the main intake project just carried forward. ARPA funds, we will be spent more in this year and probably next year. So yes, I would be happy if that's the real surplus, which is the difference between actual revenue and actual expenditure. It would be a difference between budgeted number and actual number. And so, yeah. And again, I mean, it is up to this committee and finally the recommendation to the council that, we just go with the, so yeah, I would leave it up to but our reason was to be kind of more transparent, and particularly the number involved was so big in 2 different funds. So that's why we decided to include them.
All right, Councilmember Reed, I think you were first, and then Councilmember Newsma.
Yeah. I agree with Councilmember Kelly in that I was also someone who supported and called for either this committee or council or someone to get a heads up when a fund was going to go over balance. It's for the second, and so I'd like to see that moving forward. I'd like to see that come to this committee or council or somewhere just to get approval, because I think just by state law, that's what should happen. But as far as the reduction of last year's, I mean, to me, it doesn't really matter. Either way, the money's in the account. We have whatever the surplus is. I think it would be, I think it makes sense to just, have the surplus, leave the numbers where they were. If we overestimated expenses or underestimated revenue, both of those two happening, let's just leave what we estimated, have the surplus, make the adjustments for the overages, and that should, again, happen ahead of time. But I don't think, reducing last year's budget after the fact really makes a difference. Particularly, because the whole point of the budget, setting it at a certain level, is so we don't spend over. And if folks and rightfully so sometimes, if folks overspend in a fund, regardless, then what's the point of the budget? But thank you. That's all.
Thank you. I like doing it this way. It gives us the whole picture rather than a part of the picture. It really doesn't matter. So I'm in favor of doing it this way. I do have a question relative to our previous discussion about including some additional columns on that report, which Councilmember Kelly referred to as the adopted budget. If by doing this exercise here and kind of retroactively approving a budget, is that the same thing as the adopted budget?
It becomes the amended budget, which is
It becomes the
it's a
amended
third
budget.
column.
Would be
in
a
the-
third
in the
column,
data.
which would just be confusing to look at. So I'm not, okay, that answers my question. Adopted budget is what we originally adopted in whatever budget year. What we're talking about now is amending it to just kind of bureaucratically close the books, going a little bit above and beyond what the state requires. So be it.
Point of information, I beg to differ with that categorization that the adopted budget is the budget that the council approved, whether that budget has been amended or not. Whatever final action we took to say this is our budget for this year, that's the adopted budget. So even if we amend the budget, if the week after we passed a budget, we amended it to make a slight change, that would still be the adopted budget. And so even now, this would still be the adopted budget because it's what we adopted.
I mean,
Which is what
it's not
this
a
is what
big
I'm getting at. I
difference.
don't want
Let me just
to.
clarify for how we do it in the audit. You might see the column. And the auditors do that in the previous jobs. Yeah, we see the other audit. The original budget, when it's adopted in November, December, it's called adopted budget. And again, this is how the auditors, I don't know. If we have amended the budget, they put the one column called amended budget. So they just want to reflect that this was the original budget which was adopted. Again, amended, they know that it has been approved by the council. It has been amended by the council. But the word they use is amended budget as a separate column. And if you look at some of the previous audit reports, you would see two columns, adopted budget, amended budget.
Right. So what I'm getting at is, in the future, 3 years down the road, when we're looking back at what happened in 2022, I want to be able to compare the original adopted budget to the actual spend.
It makes more sense for
Not
you
a
to-
retroactive spend, which
Right.
would make everything look like we were almost perfect.
Yeah, we would match it. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with your thing.
Yeah.
It would rather be an adopted original budget versus the
Right.
actual. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Can I also point out, it's only selected line items where the money moved from 22 to 23, where you are reducing the budget, right? It's not every line item, right? So I think the way it's presented is reasonable, right? Like the ARPA is moving to 23 and forward. The Human Services Fund, I think, is moving out. I mean, so it's not every line item where you're favorable that you're adjusting. I don't think so. Unless I'm misunderstanding.
No,
it.
it's just four big.
It's just four line
large-
items. I mean, I think this is a reasonable way to present it, where money is just moving, we're taking it out of the budget, moving it into the next year. Ms. McMillan, and then I think we can vote on this. I think we do need to vote on it, right? Yeah, we're at 6:31, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, nothing. I mean, I'm comfortable in the way this is presented, and but it is, we are meant to vote on it, right? And so I would make a motion that we adopt this as presented.
Second.
Can I have a vote?
Councilmember Nusma?
Aye.
Councilmember Wynn? Councilmember Burns?
Aye.
Councilmember Reed?
Aye.
Councilmember Kelly? Committeemember McMillan? Committeemember Rikus?
Aye.
Chair Livingston?
Aye. Okay. All right. And with that, I believe we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.